Let me start with a very basic question. What is happiness? I mean, if you can sort of just come up with do you have a quick definition for that
No,
word?
I don't have a quick definition. Psychologists have been interested in answering two questions regarding happiness. One is, what is it? And there is a kind of consensus view about what it is. And the second is, what produces it? So the way most psychologists think about happiness, it's a combination of lots of positive emotion, high positive affect, not too much negative emotion, and a high satisfaction with life. So if you have those three things, you are happy. And tools have been developed for measuring happiness that are all imperfect, but they're less noisy than you might think, given how subjective the thing is you're trying to measure. So that's kind of been the accepted view of psychologists who are interested in studying happiness. And then the question, which I will not answer now, is what determines whether you're going to be happy? And most of the attention has been directed at trying to answer that question.
Okay, well, Kim, let me follow up. What's your thumbnail understanding of happiness?
Well, I think of happiness in a similar way, but maybe I'm a little bit more coming from a practitioner's perspective. So I like the definition of happiness that thinks about need reduction. For me, that makes sense, that you're hungry, you eat, you're happy. You like shoes, you go shopping, you're happy. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But this idea that need reduction is more what happiness is. And I like to think about happiness versus meaning, which I think we're going to get to, which is meaning for me, which creates a kind of a halo of happiness, is being able to tie something to a larger purpose. And that's really the thesis of our book, which is sort of how that's happening and why that's happening. So for me, happiness is a more simplistic emotion that comes and goes, and meaning is sort of something that, as I said, sort of transcends yourself and can last throughout time a bit more.
Okay. And Darrin, I want to turn to you because the history of happiness is pretty fascinating, because it's meant a lot of different things over time. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a brief thumbnail sketch, maybe going back to the ancient Greeks.
Well, you wisely didn't ask me what happiness is, because when historians get asked these kind of questions, they can't give an answer. I had an AP reporter ask me that same question when a book had just come out. So how do you define happiness? I said, well, historians don't do that. We look at changes over time and developments and shifts. And he kept pushing me, I kept pushing back. And of course, the lead line of the story was, historian writes book on happiness, can't define it. So. I like to start with the word, and it's a really striking fact that in every Indo-European language, the word for happiness is cognate with luck. This is true in English. The word happiness derives from an Old Norse and Old English term, hap. We still use it in words like happenstance, perhaps. It simply means luck or fortune. French, it's Old French mean luck or fortune. You can just go on every language, and I think that's really, really interesting. And one of the things it says is that most cultures, for the better part of human history, didn't think of happiness as something we could attain for ourselves. Happiness was what happened to you, and that was in the hands of the gods, that was in the hands of fate, that was in the hands of fortune, and most people can't control that, right? And we think of happiness very differently, but that I think is a kind of old and abiding way. Now shall I continue?
Yeah.
That notion is, in the Western tradition, broadly speaking, attacked very explicitly by Socrates and Plato, who really sort of set the Western philosophical tradition in the direction of trying to figure out how to be happy. Okay, everyone wants to be happy. How do we bring this about? And I would argue that every major wisdom tradition, every major religious tradition, poses that same question. And the thing that they all have in common is that happiness, one, is not a fleeting emotion. In fact, it's not an emotion at all. Happiness is a product of a well-lived life. And happiness takes work, right? Happiness is not something that happens to you. Happiness is something you have to train for, that you have to, Aristotle says, happiness is a life lived according to virtue, right? The Buddha says, everyone has the capacity for happiness, but most people live lives of suffering because they haven't cultivated the resources necessary. And I think that's a really important lesson to kind of keep in mind.
So I mean, one thing that's so interesting to hear you say this is you haven't used the word pleasure at all, which is, that's such a big part of our modern understanding of happiness. So when did that happen? When did happiness get linked to having a good time?
So Jeremy Bentham, the great English utilitarian, has that phrase, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the greatest good for the greatest number. And Bentham is really sort of speaking a truth of the 18th century, and that is happiness is pleasure. That is a real shift that occurs roughly in the late 17th, 18th century. Prior to that point, no one would have equated happiness and pleasure so directly. Happiness and pleasure might have been part of a happy life, but it wasn't an emotion. So when Aristotle writes a treatise on what he called the passions, what we would call emotions, he doesn't even include happiness, because happiness isn't an emotion. Happiness is a measure or a gauge of a well-lived, flourishing whole life. Right? Some of the religious traditions accord a space for pleasure. When Christians imagine the happiness of seeing God face to face, they imagine as a kind of ecstasy. Thomas Aquinas says it'll be like being drunk on God, right? It's so great that you'll be able to look down and see people suffering in hell. That will add to your own pleasure, right? And so he has a sense of pleasure as feeling to some degree, and yet God's grace, virtuous activity are the main sort of drivers here. That is challenged in the 18th century, where happiness then becomes a kind of, something that puts a smile on your face, which is a very different thing.